This episode is brought to you by iZotope. Our friends over at iZotope create the most thoughtfully and intuitively designed software for audio repair, mixing, and mastering. I use their tools every day for the podcast, and I love it. And I think you will too. Go over to iZotope.com and check it out. That's iZotope.com. iZotope. Use the code FRET10 at checkout for a 10% discount. That's all caps, FRET, and the number 10.
Allow me to live and breathe like a man.
You've heard his words on classic albums like Pacific Ocean Blue and Friends. His 1969 collaboration with Brian Wilson, A World of Peace Must Come, gained almost legendary status as one of pop's most storied lost albums, before being resurrected to great acclaim by Light in the Attic in 2008. Now you're cordially invited to take a trip into the mind of poet and songwriter Stephen J. Kalinich. Heyday Again Records presents I Love My Life, a postcard from one of the last standing poets of peace and excitation. Order your copy today. I Love My Life by Stephen J. Kalinich and Friends. You'll see why heavy hitters like Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Paul McCartney, Steve Cropper, P.F. Sloan, and Diana Ross have all worked with him. I Love My Life by Stephen J. Kalinich. Order today at realgonemusic.com. Again, that's realgonemusic.com. Chuck says, the dogs were sitting in the studio and they were howling. We did this for 6 or 7 hours. I kept the doors closed and said, guys, please don't let the dogs outside of here. But someone opened the damn double doors, and one of the dogs went roaming around. It walked up the stairs to where the men's room was, went into where they had an answering service, and pissed on about 4 people's legs. They finally came down and asked, whose dog is that? I said, it's not mine, but there's the guy. I pointed to Brian, and he sent somebody to get it. I never did understand that session. End quote. Welcome to another episode of Discograffiti's wildly in-depth Beach Boys series and Your Dreams Come True, where Brian Wilson freaks like you and me get our chance to delve deep into the barely believable history and prodigious discography of my favorite band of all time, and also coincidentally the best, along with a slew of over 50 top-shelf guests, ranging from musicians inspired by their work, family members, documentary directors, songwriting collaborators, Beach Boys authors, producers, touring band members, and for good measure, some of the Beach Boys themselves. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and special thanks goes out to co-producers Chuck Granata, Dennis Dyken, and Mark Freed, without whom this series would not have happened. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, along with our special guest, author and pet sounds expert Chuck Granata. This is episode 7, an examination of everything you'll ever need to know about Caroline No. Here are just a few of the many things that Tony discusses with Discograffiti in this podcast. How Pet Sound's final track differs from the rest of the record, the many possible Carolines who may have inspired the song, what writing the song wound up setting in motion for Brian as he attempted to reconnect with his high school crush, Carol Mountain, an intensive breakdown of the song's mysterious coda, and how both Chuck and I connect with Caroline No in a laid-bare, explicitly personal way. If you're a Beach Boys superfan like me, you'll want to turn this free version off right now and opt for the director's cut of this episode on our Patreon page, which features 17 additional minutes of essential material. And you can find it in our Patreon shop for mere pennies at patreon.com/discograffiti/shop. And I know that I'm always talking about the many tiers that Patreon has to offer, but this week, all that I'm inviting you to do is to sign up for Patreon free of charge. Here's what you're missing this week, though, if you're not a Patreon member. If you're a member at the private tier, you're missing out on our exclusive interview with Sun-Dazed Records founder Bob Irwin on Pet Sounds, plus the early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of Graham Nash discussing David Crosby's classic solo LP, If I Could Only Remember My Name. If you're a member at the Lieutenant tier, you're missing out on the interview with Bob Irwin, and if you're a member at the Major tier, well, you're not missing a thing. But even if you're on the fence, just head over there, because it's finally free to become a basic member. And you don't want to miss being notified about every single one of these episodes. Because coming up, we got an interview with Lenny Waronker, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, Tony Asher, Jimmy Webb, Kim Fowley, Phil Ramone, Paul Tanner, Mark Lynette, Billy Strange, Hal Blaine, Larry Levine, Carol Kay, plus an incredibly special Graham Nash deep dive, in which Graham himself rates and discusses everything he's ever released. That means solo, CSN, CSNY, CNN, and for good measure, Crosby's If I Could Only Remember My Name. So don't miss out. Open up your listening app right now and subscribe. And away we go then. Welcome, lads and ladies, to episode 7, the final chapter, the thrilling, emotional catharsis, the fantastic conclusion to the Pet Sounds deep dive, the most granular, Benz-inducing experience that you have ever endured, and that Chuck and I certainly have ever endured. And this is just going to be an overview of Caroline No, the very final track on the album, not to mention the tag that closes the song. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm present and accounted for, and I am thankful that you invited me.
Let's do this thing. And would you please stop condescending to me?
I have no need to condescend to anyone, my friend. I only speak truth.
I was testing you, and you passed with flying colors. All right, so Caroline No has the distinction of being the very beginning origin point of Brian Wilson's solo career. This was released as Brian's very first solo record on March 7th, 1966, and then 2 months later, it was reissued as the closing track on the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds. He wrote it with Tony Asher, and the lyrics describe a disillusioned man who reflects on his former love interest and the loss of her innocence. Musically, it's distinguished for an unusual combination of instruments, including bass flutes, 12-string electric guitar, and muted harpsichord.
Not to mention a Sparkletts water bottle, but we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Brian produced this track in early 1966 at Western Studio with 12 session musicians who variously played harpsichord, flutes, guitars, basses, and vibraphone. Brian later cited Caroline No as his favorite track on Pet Sounds. I can't disagree with that. And among the finest songs he felt he ever wrote.
I have to say that this song, it feels a little bit different from the rest of the material on the record. There's something about this that feels a little bit more bald-faced than a lot of the record. A lot of the record has thickly interwoven tapestries of different contrapuntal harmony lines going on, and this feels a little bit more point-blank and direct. And the album ends, just as it begins, with a question. The beginning of the record is, wouldn't it be nice if we were older? Here it's, where did your long hair go? Where is the girl I used to know? How could you lose that happy glow? And it's honestly something that I never actually connected until doing the research on the record and actually coming across it in your book, Chuck. Really, really nice perception there that you picked up in doing the research here.
Well, thanks, David. I have always felt that this was Brian's absolute American songbook moment. So I'm going to go back to Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, who wrote what is considered probably the greatest love song of all time, All the Things You Are. And it doesn't even use the word love once in the lyric. And the opening words are, "You are the promised breath of springtime that makes the lonely winter seem long." Well, when you listen to these lyrics in Caroline No, I think they have the same impact, the same eloquence as what Oscar Hammerstein wrote for All the Things You Are. It's just a different decade, but it's the same feeling and it's the same emotion. It's the same message that you're trying to impart. So this, to me, is Brian's moment in the sun as a standard songwriter. And to me, I would agree with Brian. I agree with you. I think this is the greatest song he ever wrote, and I think it's the greatest song on the album. The only song to me that rivals the depth of the message here is The Warmth of the Sun, which we know he wrote as a comfort to himself in the wake of JFK's assassination. So, those are two songs that really have this incredible depth and this real songwriting craft, interwoven in to not just the lyrics, but the music.
Brian turned inward for inspiration. Tony Asher says that he was specific in articulating his vision for the song. And Tony says, quote, "While we were toiling away on Caroline No, Brian expressed a desire to go back to simpler days. Perhaps that's what we discussed and expressed here metaphorically. At that point, he was under a tremendous amount of pressure and yearned for a time when he wasn't shouldering all the weight of the band. Was there a Caroline who may have inspired the song? Well, not exactly. I had broken up with my high school girlfriend, a dancer who had moved to New York looking to make a break on Broadway. When I went east to visit her a short time later, I found that she had made some radical changes. Her name, incidentally, was Carol. And yes, she had cut her hair. But what I saw went deeper than the cosmetic changes. She had become a far more worldly person. It was clear that New York had caused her to grow up, and fast."
This is Tony continuing. "When I first sang the lyric to Brian, I sang, 'Oh, Carol, I know.' I envisioned a song in which the girl had undergone these changes, as I had seen in my Carol, and was attempting to explain to her former lover the inevitability of growing up. My intent was to have him answer her with the line, 'Oh, Carol, I know.' The purpose was to acknowledge the inevitable growth and for him to articulate that he missed the old her. Brian heard it as Caroline, no, which to me was a much stronger and more interesting line than the one I had in mind. I never thought of this as a Beach Boys song because Brian played it at the piano and sang his own part. When he played the other songs at the piano, he would play the parts that the other guys would eventually sing. That didn't happen with Caroline No. At first, I didn't think it was on the same level as the other songs we were doing, although I liked it well enough. It just didn't have the level of sophistication that the other songs had. Parenthetically, I have to disagree with my friend Tony Asher. I think this has tremendous sophistication.
I agree with what you're saying there, but I believe what he's picking up there is that directness that I had referenced before, where, there's not these thick, interwoven, countering melodies that create this overstuffed tapestry of sonics. It really is a much more direct message, at least how I hear it, is that the lack of sophistication that he's tipping his hat to is more of just a directness of intent.
And I'm going to view this through the lens of a record producer. So what a perfect and sophisticated way to end the album. You've been brought through this roller coaster of emotion, and then all of a sudden, there's this simple, melancholic, beautifully expressed bit of music that leaves you with a very wistful feeling. It's not much unlike what Carole King did on Tapestry. She had some amazingly orchestrated and well-arranged tunes on that record. Yet the song Tapestry is so simple and elegant, and that's the title. And that really ties it all together and gives you this very satisfying feeling when you hear it.
Brian said in 1995 that it's a very, very big ballad. That song was probably the best I've ever written. 6 years earlier in 1989, he said, quote, "Caroline No is a story about how once you've fucked up or once you've run your gamut with a chick, there's no way to get it back. It takes a lot of courage to do that sometimes in your life. It's a pretty love song about how this guy and this girl lost it and there's no way to get it back. I just felt sad, so I wrote a sad song. Let's go into the background of this thing and dig into the lyrics. This song was written, like we said before, by Brian and Tony, possibly within a few days of writing Wouldn't It Be Nice? Although Brian claimed that Tony only provided the words to his music, Tony credited himself with contributing musical ideas to at least 3 songs on the record, including Caroline No. He credited Brian with the subject matter, however, as he had, quote, always wanted to write a song about lost innocence, a young girl who changes as she matures, and somehow something's lost.
Caroline No is really a continuation of the themes previously established in Wilson's You Still Believe in Me and The Little Girl I Once Knew. The protagonist is thoroughly heartbroken and disillusioned and longs for a return to the youthful innocence of childhood. This is Wouldn't It Be Nice in reverse.
That's just brilliant. I gotta say, that is just staggeringly brilliant.
I really think it's a ruminating tune that represents the antithesis of most of the Beach Boys' familiar hits.
Agreed. And by the way, I had a flash. If you took out the title track and right in that spot put in The Little Girl I Once Knew, that would be a really interesting twist in the record, because you have 2 songs that are both about loss of innocence, but the tone is 180 degrees different.
Interesting.
Anyway, just a thought. It was a flash in my mind, and
I like that.
It would play interestingly. But the thing I think about the most about this song is what inspired it, because there are so many possibilities, especially if you throw Tony's possibility into the mix. But like their other collaborations, Caroline No was based on the songwriter's real-life experiences. According to Tony, the discussions that led to the song had revolved around, quote, how wonderful it was when you first meet a girl and she looks great, and how terrible it is when you know you'll be breaking up at any moment, end quote. He said that it was originally a happier song, but Brian moved it into a sadder direction because Brian was, quote, saddened to see how sweet little girls turned out to be kind of bitchy, hardened adults, end quote.
Don't we all? You know, in so many ways, Caroline No summarizes the thoughts that have crossed the minds of so many of us. What would I do if I suddenly ran into my high school sweetheart? How would he or she look? Could we possibly rekindle our romance? Here, the character looks back with fondness on the relationship he shared with his childhood crush and contemplates what might have been. The question, Caroline, why, in the last verse leads us to believe that he's not sure why the relationship ended. Perhaps his girlfriend left him without explanation, and seeing her again prompts him to question what went wrong. Ultimately, the character realizes that nothing can turn back the hands of time, and Brian answers the question, could we ever bring them back once they have gone, in the form of a heartrending wail at the song's end. It is, as one might expect, a resounding Caroline No.
Which really is not a disappointment as far as a catharsis that comes at the end of the record. That particular wail, it gets the list. I mean, it certainly gets me every time I hear it, and it sends you out just wrung out. That one note that he hits, first of all, who else can hit that note? And second of all, the way that he grabs onto that thing and rides it out. It's just too much, man. I mean, coming at the end of the whole kit and caboodle, it is truly a magnificent punctuation mark at the end of this thing.
It's the one that cuts to the bone on this record.
Here's some research that I did that I'm truly excited to dig into here. Carol Mountain. So Dennis Wilson, in a 1976 interview, said that Caroline No was, quote, about a girl that Brian was really in love with in high school. He saw her again years later, and it all came back to him, and he wrote the song, end quote. Brian's 1991 memoir supports that the song had derived from his past infatuation with a high school classmate named Carol Mountain. He writes, quote, I'd reminisce to Tony about my high school crush on Carol Mountain and sighed, if I saw her today, I'd probably think, God, she's lost something, because growing up does that to people. but the song was most influenced by the changes my first wife Marilyn and I had gone through. We were young, Marilyn nearing 20, and me closing in on 24, yet I thought we'd lost the innocence of our youth and the heavy seriousness of our lives.
Asked about Caroline No in a 1996 interview, Marilyn said that she had not heard too much of the song until the track was recorded and Brian had brought an acetate home. She acknowledged that the song had been difficult to listen to, as she was aware that Wilson's first crush was for a girl named Carol. Marilyn went on to say that Brian constantly remembers his past and still relates to it and everybody in it. And that's another thing at 17 years old that was hard for me to understand. You want this man to talk about you, and he was talking all about his old girlfriends.
Now, here's something that I was so jaw agape to find out about.
This is really amazing.
This is pretty
David.
crazy, but
Yeah.
In the autumn of '66, months after the release of Pet Sounds, Brian attempted to reconnect with Carol, acting on the suggestion of his friend Stanley Shapiro. And according to Shapiro, Brian had phoned every person named Mountain listed in the Hawthorne-Inglewood area until he found her parents, who gave Brian her address. Brian then drove with Shapiro to Carol's house, intending to bring her to his home on Laurel Way, but he was unsuccessful in doing so. Stanley Shapiro said, quote, "It was the funniest thing I had ever seen in my life. We were bombed out of our minds. He's standing on the doorstep, ringing her doorbell, and Carol Mountain opened the door with rollers in her hair. Mountain refused to leave with Brian, and her husband threatened to retrieve his gun, prompting Brian and Shapiro to flee. Brian continued to telephone Mountain following this incident. She recalled, quote, "He didn't sound drugged or anything, but it was very strange. He would call at 3 a.m. and want to talk about music. I was such a nerd, I would say, 'What? Who?' and have him talk to my husband, but it was nothing inappropriate," end quote.
That is just so incredibly wild. And for sure, if I had had any way to connect with Carol Mountain back when I was researching and writing my book, I certainly would have.
Honestly, I only didn't do it in deference to the family, especially after his passing, in deference to Carney, to Marilyn, Ginger, and everyone else who had given their time so graciously. I just figured it would be an affront to go down that road.
Marilyn Wilson said of her reaction to the lyrics, "I thought it was about me because I had cut my hair. Brian always used to talk about how long hair keeps a girl feminine." In a 1994 interview, Brian credited that particular line to Asher, who must have known a girl who cut her hair off. Asher himself confirmed that his lyrics had been inspired by a former high school girlfriend named Carol Amon, who had moved to New York to become a Broadway dancer. He said, quote, "When I went east to visit her a scant year after the move, she had changed radically. Yes, she had cut her hair, but she was a far more worldly person, not all for the worst," end quote. Contradicting the account taken from Brian's memoir, Asher recalled that he had not been told about Carol Mountain when composing Caroline No. In a 2005 interview, Brian said that the song wasn't written about anyone. I just used the name Caroline.
And then in Brian's 2016 memoir, he says that the song was, quote, "sort of about Marilyn, but as time went on, sort of also about me. I know Tony didn't write it that way," end quote. And by the way, I just love how the song, it turns out it's about something else, or it just becomes about other people, even though the intention at the time was certainly, I'm guessing, a little bit more fixed than that. But, you know, all this stuff is so malleable that it kind of makes for endless speculation. Bruce Johnston similarly denied that Caroline was a real person and said that the song was actually, quote, "directly about Brian himself and the death of a quality within him that was so vital, his innocence. He knows it too." And by the way, I tend to, although I don't often agree with Bruce, I totally agree with Bruce here. Tony supported that another impetus for the song was, quote, Brian's wish that he could go back to simpler days. His wish that the group could return to the days when the whole thing was a lot of fun and very little pressure, end quote. He told biographer David Leaf that Brian also had in mind, quote, sweet little girls and his wife's sister, end quote.
That's really, really interesting and deep.
And not only that, but if it happens to be about Diane, and if the first song happens to have the subtext of Diane in there, then we really have a full circle thing going on with this record.
For sure.
Future Prophet Records presents Gargoyle's new single, Alligator Head. This and other essential singles from the New York Underground, all designed to catapult today's great bands into tomorrow, and all available at futureprophetrecords.com. That's PROPHET, futureprophetrecords.com. This is only one of 2 tracks on Pet Sounds with just one vocal part. The others don't talk, put your head on my shoulder. Jim Fusilli, who's the author of the 33 and a third book on the album, concurred that, quote, in many ways, it's a jazz tune. Some of those chords are jazz chords, end quote. Tony said that he had implored Brian to incorporate the bass flute, so apparently that's Tony's idea. Brian commented, quote, the fade out was like a 1944 kind of record. Listen for the flutes in the fade out, end quote.
You know, that bass flute is so effective. This to me is also an apex in terms of Brian's sensibility as an arranger. It's not always about a lot of texture and a lot of movement and a lot of instrumentation. Here, it's a very simple pad and then this beautiful, whimsical bass flute that just transports you in your mind to another place. Like you can see the sunset and, you know, see the water in front of you, and it just feels so beautiful. And it's almost as though that music is washing over you, just like a wave might gently roll in and wash over you if you were laying on the shore. And that's really music at its best. It's when it moves us to have a picture in our mind of the setting for which it was written. And I don't think Brian ever did it as well as here.
To me, the flutes are the innocence, and the fade is the slow disappearing of that innocence. It's perfect.
And that's a perfect metaphor, honestly. In recalling the sessions for Caroline No, my dear friend, bassist Carol Kay, said, quote, something must have happened to Brian. I can remember he looked so sad. When he'd catch me checking out his face, he'd look back at me with a kind of deep, unexplainable, sad look. I had never seen him like that before. He was happy with the music, though. It seemed to be his expression of some feeling he couldn't put into words. Not much of a tune, just a mood, end quote. Now, earlier takes featured an instrumental intro before Brian opted for the final arrangement. An empty Sparkletts water cooler jug struck from the bottom with a hard percussion mallet. That's not an easy sound to obtain. They actually took the water jug, put a microphone inside. Hal Blaine struck the bottom with the mallet, and then they processed it to give it that really interesting sound. So again, another production technique that really lends Caroline No a beautiful aura and atmosphere. Tony Asher remembered that he never had the impression of Caroline No being a Beach Boys song. Unlike the pair's other collaborations, Brian never demonstrated on piano the vocal parts that his bandmates would sing, and ultimately they didn't sing anything on it. During the mastering process, Brian sped up the track by a semitone, following the advice of his father, Murray, who thought that the vocal would benefit from sounding younger. In doing so, the song's tempo increased by 6%. While the key was raised from C to C sharp.
And by the way, Murray did that on their very first single, Surfin'. I mean, talk about a song that this one has absolutely nothing in common with, yet he used the same trick that Murray used on Surfin', which is, I have to think that that's almost like, a last-ditch attempt to add a bit of youth, ironically, because the song being about the hardening and disappearing of youth. Honestly, I am thinking about this without this being in my notes, and it's striking me at the last minute while we're actually discussing this. I'm blown away by it. This guy is trying to inject a tone of youth into a song that's about the loss of innocence, and I'm realizing how unbelievably brilliant that is. Here is a song about loss of innocence and about the end of youth, and he's trying to make his vocal sound younger. Do you think he actually intended thematically for that to be an element here?
I guess in a way, but doing something like that is always a dicey proposition, especially when this song was not a standalone that wouldn't be heard right next to all these other tracks. And if you veer too far, you risk it sounding almost cartoonish.
It would sound like the Chipmunks, which is right. What they did to make the Chipmunks.
Yes, but not quite that bad, because 6% is not a huge increase, but it's enough to change the key. I don't know if he would have made that conscientious decision. I'm not really sure. That's a great question.
Maybe he was just trying to give the single more of a chance in the marketplace by giving it a youthful kick in the butt. But what I'm saying is that it ties in thematically in a way that's so profoundly deep that it possibly could have been unconscious.
I think it was unconscious, but I think its placement on the album was deliberate. I would be shocked if he didn't give some real thought to the placement and where Caroline No stood on the album, because it's so powerful and it's such an important message. I mean, it really ties things up.
I can't imagine that this wasn't always intended as the closing song. I think it had to have been, because where else would it go? There's nowhere else for this song to go but the end. And the failure of the song as a single to create a buzz raises a pretty important question, and one that you explore in your book, Chuck, in a very satisfying way. Would Pet Sounds have fared better had it been marketed as a Brian Wilson solo album? And, I think, and I think you think, probably not. If the public couldn't warm up to an outstanding song like Caroline No, which was marketed as a single, then there's little reason to believe that an entire album, as great and as glorious as it is, would have fared any better. But the foreshadowing of this as a single, which came out a couple months before the actual album, it foretold the story of what the record was going to experience. But, let's look at the connective thread for us emotionally, seeing this as an emotional concept album.
Well, I just think it's one of the most beautiful and melancholic melodies I have ever listened to. And I think anyone who has been in a relationship and who has lost someone, especially to someone else, or who has had this wistful thought of, hey, what if I went back 5, 10, 20 years, can relate to this record and relate to what Brian is singing about. The fact that it's so beautifully orchestrated and arranged so brilliantly just really amps up that emotional factor. So for me, it's something that has always resonated because, like everyone else, I lost a love or two, and it's not easy, especially when you're 17, 18. And this really was something that I could relate to, simply because it's just one of those emotions that we all go through and we all wonder about later, certainly. How, who among us hasn't said, hey, I wonder what happened to Sally, or whatever your girlfriend's name was, or boyfriend, whatever you want to say. But, this really was a novel approach that Dan Fogelberg took really to its apex with his record, Same Old Lang Syne, because it's the same idea, except he actually writes about running into his old girlfriend in the grocery store and that interplay between them, that awkwardness, but that warm feeling that he got. I think that's really a bookend to Caroline No in terms of a thematic way to look at lost love.
For me, I really find it to be a much more interesting song when it's not pitched as a Carol Mountain song or a Marilyn song or the other Carol that Tony was singing about. I connect mainly with this being a self-reflective look at loss of innocence. That's where it really hits hard for me.
I agree.
It's easy to point the finger out at someone else's lost innocence, and to me, makes it a much less interesting song. But taking responsibility for and mourning the loss of your own innocence is something far different entirely, and it's a much harder topic as a song to tackle. And thus, I think using Carol Mountain as an avatar, or using Tony's Carol, or even using Marilyn as a sort of repository of, emotional feelings that are much harder to tackle when looking right in the mirror. When I think about this song as something that Brian is singing to himself through somebody else, it hits really hard. And for me, it was difficult to let go of my innocence. It was not an easy thing for me to do, because I truly believe that kids and dogs are really the ultimate in terms of the source of wisdom that we have on this planet to learn from. I don't think kids have nearly as much to learn from adults as we do from children. And to have all that taken away as you grow up and get older and, farm that out based on being sort of once bitten, twice shy, learning from experience, and then finally being, a more hardened adult is a very painful process, was a very painful process. Giving that up is giving up wisdom, is giving up true wisdom for me to really kind of turn around and concede to the fact that you've gotten older and you're grown up fucking sucks. It's terrible. And I don't want any of it. I don't want any of being an adult, because it's really for the birds.
What do they say? Growing up ain't for sissies?
It's definitely not. Being an adult is no fun. Even the versions of being fun that adults have are awful. What is it, like potluck parties and bedtime at 9, and it's just awful.
Well, listen, we're there. We're past our middle age. So I take a lot of...
I don't think we're past our middle age.
Oh, well, I'm 62, so I'm past my middle age.
Yeah, you're older than me. You're definitely...
I am.
You're, looking into hospice at this point. I'm not...
I'm making arrangements in case I need hospice, at least. That's for sure. No, I really get what you're saying, but I don't ever feel despair. I feel like I am fortunate that I have this deep appreciation for music, and that's what keeps me focused on moving forward.
Music keeps me young for sure, and my son keeps me young.
And my kids too, of course. That goes without saying. The family is paramount. But in terms of what motivates me to keep working and keep engaged, it's the music. There's always something to learn. I feel, to me, that's the one thing that I feel sad about, is that I will never have enough time in my lifetime to enjoy all the music I want to enjoy and learn about. So I just keep trying to learn a little bit about all kinds of music every day.
I already want my 6-year-old to have children, because he's too old for me to learn from already. He's already turning into a hardened adult.
Well, unfortunately, kids have it a lot differently than we had it growing up. True. They have to grow up faster. They're exposed to a lot more than we could ever even imagine at their ages.
He still hasn't heard the F word.
That's amazing.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
No, of course. Well, I know you, so I can't imagine that. So we should just talk a little bit about the closing of Caroline No and the album, because it's interesting and metaphoric, or you could look at it and say it makes no sense.
So when it came to closing the record, Brian knew, I don't know exactly how early into the process, but he knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted a non-musical tag that would end Caroline No and the album on a sorrowful note. As the breezy tropical notes of the bass flutes and the vibes bring the song to its conclusion, we hear 2 dogs barking as a train rumbles past, its lonesome whistle fading slowly into the distance. And gratefully, in a way to keep the mystery upheld, nobody remembers how he came up with the idea.
Yeah. I mean, metaphorically, it's a train and you hear the trailing off of the whistle, and it's like the train going into a tunnel. It's, where does the relationship go?
You know what I always used to think as a teenager and going into my very early 20s, what I always imagined was a train that took you away from the pain.
That's a great way to look at it. And maybe that's the message. Or like everything else, things fade, memories fade, relationships fade, the feelings of what it was like when you were younger fades. And that could be the message as well.
So the train was sampled from the 1963 effects album, Mr. D's Machine. And the track itself is called Train Number 58, The Owl at Edison, California. The Owl was a Southern Pacific Railroad train that ran an overnight route between San Francisco and Los Angeles from 1898 to 1965. Believe it or not, the horn sounds a B-flat 7 trichord that transforms into a G7 as a consequence of the Doppler effect as it approaches a railway crossing. I love that fact that I was able to bring that to the mix here.
So I don't think I can attach anything metaphoric to the use of the dogs barking, which is coupled with the train, other than Brian wanted to memorialize his two dogs, Banana and Louie, who he loved, on this record. Asked in a 1996 interview, Brian said, "I'm not really sure what I had in mind. I can't answer that question. I took a tape recorder and I recorded their barks. And we went down and we looked through some sound effects tapes and we found a train. So we just put it all together."
So the session at which Brian recorded the dogs, Banana, by the way, was a beagle and Louie was a Weimaraner, was apparently one of the most bizarre that Chuck Britz ever supervised. March 22nd, that was the date of the session, Brian came to Western and brought his dogs. Chuck says, "The dogs were sitting in the studio and they were howling. We did this for 6 or 7 hours. I kept the doors closed and said, 'Guys, please don't let the dogs outside of here.' But someone opened the damn double doors and one of the dogs went roaming around. It walked up the stairs to where the men's room was, went into where they had an answering service, and pissed on about 4 people's legs. They finally came down and asked, 'Whose dog is that?' I said, 'It's not mine, but there's the guy.' I pointed to Brian and he sent somebody to get it. I never did understand that session." End quote. And by the way, it's sometimes suggested that the animal sound effects inspired a similar gaggle of effects in the Beatles song Good Morning from Sgt. Pepper. And obviously, they took a whole bunch of stuff, the bass harmonica, the upper fret bass playing, all kinds of different signifiers from Pet Sounds. So it's certainly possible. Why don't you tell us about the horses? Oh, hi, I'm Dave Gebrow. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 5-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate weekly podcast for music obsessives thrive. But weekly wasn't enough for me, so I bumped it up to 4 shows a week. Becoming a subscriber to Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to hundreds of exclusive episodes. As a 2-show per week private, you get the weekly show by and for our Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. As a 3-show-a-week lieutenant, you'll get early release, ad-free, extended director's cuts of the main show. They're the shows as they were intended to be heard. Plus, you'll gain access to half the Patreon archive and the upcoming Beach Boys Behind the Mirror companion episodes, which will feature dozens of special guests from within the Beach Boys camp talking about and rating their music. But as a 4-show-per-week major, you'll be drowning in a flood of must-hear binge listening, because I'll be bombarding you with episodes about super cool bands that are too subterranean for free Fridays. It's like going to music college, but with a tuition that makes all kinds of sense. Plus, our entire Patreon archive is yours. Discograffiti's Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, and the Private Press with Paul Major. And all that for the price of only a cup of coffee a week. Times are tough, you say? Fret not, because there's a $1 tier. Or you could just join as a basic member and buy episodes piecemeal from our Patreon shop. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Check out patreon.com/Discograffiti to find the tier that's right for you. Once again, that's patreon.com/Discograffiti. This episode is brought to you in part by Bespoke LA. Located in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles, Bespoke LA is the modern podcaster's dream come true. It's got 2 podcast pods available, one with audio only and the other with both audio and video. Just think, you can start your own podcast tomorrow without investing a single penny in equipment. What, you don't have experience editing? Don't even sweat it. For an additional fee, Bespoke LA can edit your podcast. Or not, it's entirely up to you. Rates start at $75 an hour with discounts if you book 4 sessions at once. Go to bespokela.com/podcast. That's BSPOKELA.com/podcast for more information or to book your time today. And be sure to tell them that Dave sent you for a one-time 25% discount.
Oh, the horses. Oh my gosh. I mean, if things weren't as crazy as they could get, Chuck Britz was absolutely unprepared for one of Brian's next requests. Thinking it would make for a great album cover, he wanted to photograph a horse in Western Studio 3.
And I want to say the Pet Sounds CD release from 1990, the reissue, has a little bit of this conversation, but not the whole thing. So to actually know the whole vibe of what happened is really cool after decades of sitting with only a clip of that conversation.
It's pretty wild, and you could hear the incredulity in Chuck Britz's voice. Brian said, "Hey, Chuck, is it possible we can bring a horse in here if we don't screw anything up?" Britz, "I beg your pardon?" Brian, "I want to get a picture of the horse in front of the microphone. Honest to God, the horse is tame and everything." Britz, "Just bring his trainer along behind him." Carl, "Brian, my horse would be so bitchin' in here." Needless to say, that last idea was scrapped, much to Chuck Britz's relief.
And I gotta say, Chuck's "I beg your pardon" is the greatest "I beg your pardon" that I've ever heard in my entire life.
Yeah,
it really is the greatest usage of that phrase I've ever come across in my life.
Well, he just can't believe it.
He's truly perplexed, truly perplexed.
Edwin Pouncey of The Wire describes the atmospheric, evocative, and lonesome-sounding album tag as one of several notable pop and rock musique concrète flirtations from the period, while Adam Webb of BBC Music deems it a forlorn soundtrack.
It's nice, actually, to just touch on the tag, because I feel like, honestly, just those few seconds, it's easy to blow through it, but I really tried to squeeze as much factual information out of my research as I could from your book, from other sources. I mean, even just what the track that train was taken from is called. It's just so cool to have that information. Let's talk about the release of Caroline No. So on March 7th, 1966, Caroline No, backed with the Summer Days and Summer Nights instrumental Summer Means New Love, was issued by Capitol as Brian's first solo record. According to Keith Badman, quote, "Everyone close to Brian was certain that the disc would be a monster hit. In Marilyn's recollection, quote, "Everybody at Capitol said it should be a single because it was so good, and there were no background vocals, so they said, why don't we release this as a Brian Wilson single, because it's really not a Beach Boys song."
Conversely, biographer Stephen Gaines wrote that Capitol knew it was not a hit, but released the song to encourage Brian to complete the forthcoming album. Tony Asher recalled that the criticism Brian received from his bandmates about the song not being Beach Boys enough was what prompted him to issue the single under his own name. Session musician Steve Douglas, a great saxophonist, told an interviewer that he had been really instigating Brian to issue the single as a solo record, a decision that ultimately caused problems.
And Chuck, what actually wound up happening as a result of this thing first debuting at number 37 and then only squeaking up to peak at number 32 during its 7 weeks on the charts is that Capitol really quickly wound up issuing Sloop John B as a single to cover up the unimpressive performance of Caroline No. In the UK, Caroline No was issued in April and totally failed to chart.
Right.
Brian was asked in 2001 if he would have issued Pet Sounds as a solo album had the single performed better, to which he responded, quote, "Probably would have, yeah, but I didn't." When Brian was asked again later, he said, "No, I just wanted to do that one. Caroline No fit my voice more than the other guys." And by the way, it does have a jazzy, non-hit style to it. So I think this thing was set up for Capitol to pull some shenanigans. It seems kind of bizarre that it was released as a single to me. It's not really a single.
Right. You're saying they might have sabotaged the album?
Either that, or maybe Brian was kicking back against Sloop John B being a single, and they wanted to toss a bomb out so they would have an excuse to use Sloop John B. I don't know.
Right. That makes sense.
But it doesn't check that they would get behind Caroline No.
I agree, especially since it was probably the most non-Beach Boys song next to Don't Talk on the record.
Right.
Well, Brian revisited the themes of Caroline No in his 1988 song, Baby Let Your Hair Grow Long, from his first solo album, Brian Wilson.
Which, by the way, came out this week 37 years ago, in July 1988.
The Beach Boys, accompanied by Timothy B. Schmidt, remade the song with a new multi-part vocal arrangement for the 1996 album Stars and Stripes Volume 1. Jimmy Webb was commissioned to write the orchestration for that track,
which he talks about in your interview with him, which is cool. However, unfortunately, that record is absolutely nobody's favorite Beach Boys record of all time across the board. But Baby Let Your Hair Grow Long, I do really love that song. And that is definitely some kind of a spiritual successor to Caroline No. Not only that, but, and I think this was definitely a mistake, Brian Wilson from 1988, they were calling that record Pet Sounds 88 in the marketing of it.
I vaguely remember that, but I really didn't pay much attention to it because, you can't compare Pet Sounds to anything. No. Not even by Brian Wilson.
Well, certainly not a record that's overstuffed with synthesizers. Right. I love that record, but it is not Pet Sounds 88.
For sure.
Let's talk about the pop culture breadcrumb trail that Caroline No has had. Neil Young mentions the song very notably and very beautifully in the title track to the Stills Young Band album, the only album they ever had, Long May You Run from 1976.
A song called Does Caroline Know, K-N-O-W, appears on the second studio album by Talk Talk, It's My Life, 1984.
And by the way, Talk Talk wound up becoming a very Pet Sounds influence band, but oddly enough, definitely not this early in their career when they released Does Caroline Know. They were at that point an MTV-style synth pop band, but they became enormously sophisticated. The British band Modesty Blaze released the sunshine pop single Carol Mountain in 2002.
A song called Caroline Yes appears on the Kaiser Chiefs album Employment in 2005.
Another song called Caroline Mountain appears on Sugar Candy Mountain's album Mystic Hits from 2013.
I mean, that's really inside baseball.
Seriously.
The 2014 biopic Love and Mercy includes a depiction of the recording of Caroline No and its dog barking session.
Amazing. There's a whole slew of cover versions of this song. The first one was by the Holly Ridge Strings on their album Beach Boys Songbook Volume 2 from the year 1967, which is only months after this came out.
A year later, Nick DeCaro covered it in 1968.
In 1970, his old pal Gary Usher did it for Add Some Music to Your Day, a symphonic tribute to Brian Wilson. And by the way, parenthetically, it is said that Gary Usher snooped into the Smile tracks, broke into the Smile tapes, and listened through them in order to create the Sagittarius song My World Fell Down.
Was that sanctioned by Brian? How did he get the keys to the vault?
In fact, all that kind of business is apparently what motivated Brian to start recording at home.
That's fascinating. In 1993, Ian McNabb included it as a B-side to Great Dreams of Heaven, his 12-inch single.
In 1999, the great Elliot Easton from The Cars recorded it for Sounds of Wood and Steel Part 2.
In 2000, the Aluminum Group recorded it for a compilation called Caroline Now, the songs of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys.
Again in 2000, Eric Carmen from the Raspberries recorded a solo version of it for his album I Was Born to Love You.
2004, They Might Be Giants included it on Indestructible Object.
In 2006, The Wedding Present did it for Do It Again, a tribute to Pet Sounds.
And in 2009, Charles Lloyd recorded it for his album, Mirror.
Charles Lloyd being an old TM buddy of the Beach Boys who did a bunch of absolutely incredible recordings with them in the early 70s that we'll be talking about down the line. And in 2011, from the group America, Dewey Bunnell did a version of it for Back Pages.
Then in 2012, Eagle Glenn Fry covered it for After Hours.
In 2013, Ken Peplowski did a version of it for his record Maybe September.
And in 2019, Chrissy Hind of the Pretenders covered it for Valve Bone Woe. By the way, my buddy Ken Peplowski's version is really, really beautiful. Ken is a great clarinetist and saxophonist who played with Benny Goodman, is one of the greats in the jazz world and is so sensitive. And his version is one of my favorites.
Really? Okay, I got to check that out. So once the songs were finished, Brian focused on completing the recordings while Tony Asher returned to his job at Carson Roberts, the ad agency. The lyricist recently characterized his weeks working on Pet Sounds as one of the true highlights of his life. Here's Tony on it. Quote, "For me, the whole experience was almost dreamlike. Unfortunately, he didn't have the chance to witness Brian polishing their words and music in the recording studio. Quote, Brian was spending more time in the studio, so we were getting together less often. I went to a few sessions, mostly string overdub dates. Brian would call me when he wanted me to hear something, but I was working and needed to refocus on my job. Except for those few sessions, I didn't hear the album until it was done." End quote. It was another 11 long years until the Beach Boys' Love You was released, and Brian said that it was, quote, "the first time since Pet Sounds that I've felt this thoroughly satisfied with an album." Amazing.
It's profound. Yeah, for sure.
Well, here's something I wrote just kind of off the cuff. I didn't trim or tailor or anything. This was just something I had to get off my chest as a capsule review of this record, seeing as it's meant so much to me and continues to this day. Pet Sounds is my second favorite album of all time. For me, the only record that affects me in a deeper, more profound, and more soul-shattering way is Smile, which is just around the corner. I always felt like Brian had to tend to all his earthly concerns so that he can lighten his load and be able to fly free, untethered through the cosmos, and tackle everything else that's not of this earth. Pet Sounds makes up the composition of the human heart. It's the DNA of the human emotional system, but Smile is, to me at least, every last thing outside of that. Literally all of time and space, man, woman, and child compacted into one work. In Finnegan's Wake, a device that I remember James Joyce used was that every person, every location, every last thing was an echo of everything that came before it in an eternal reverberation that began at the origin point when this whole shebang big banged. And that's Smile. And so obviously, when I take one of the two records into consideration, I can't not also talk about the other. They complement each other in an inextricable way. Pet Sounds is the most moved I've ever been by an LP. It's shown me over and over, repeatedly since approximately 1990, that ripping the bark off the tree and connecting to your feelings is the most direct pathway to pure beauty. How to thank Brian for this, really. He was inspired to plow into the work utilizing the final vestiges of competitive high school football fighting spirit upon hearing Rubber Soul while stoned off his ass, but he was primed for battle in a critically unguarded way, which is why Pet Sounds remains the balm for and answer to anything and everything. It's that all-encompassing. It's that large in its scope. It's that dynamic in its inward reach. and in stark contrast to most of the music of that time. And I believe why ultimately it just didn't make it and took so long to be recognized is that its spirit ultimately is entirely feminine, and it lacks almost completely that masculine energy that informed most of the successful 1960s pop music. I'm going to give this 5 stars.
Wow, that's really amazing. Well, what can I say that I haven't already said about Pet Sounds? I wrote a book on it, and it's also, to me, something that in its own way is equal to what Beethoven did with his Fifth Symphony. I absolutely give it 5 stars.
Chuck, your work on Pet Sounds, to me, is the most important work aside from the music itself. And I strongly urge everybody listening to this show, as I've included the link to be able to order his book on Amazon with every single promotional ad on social media, to go out and get Chuck's book to gain a fuller, broader understanding of this great album, because your book is a companion piece that one must read to really fully understand this incredible record.
Thank you, David. That's high praise indeed.
I love you, man. I really appreciate not only, all your time in doing the series, but your interviews, your Chuck chats. Somehow you and I crossing paths, the timing of it was really insane. Kind of like Brian and Tony meeting at the time at which they did. Your entry into my life and mine and yours came at a very strange moment for both of us. And I'm so thankful that it did.
I am too. I love you too, brother.
All right, that about does it. Stay tuned, because next week brings upon us Graham Nash and I doing a deep dive on one of the greatest albums of all time, David Crosby's classic solo debut, If I Could Only Remember My Name. Okay, here's the week up ahead. This Sunday, our weekly show within a show, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast, drops for our Patreon's private tier. These are real people with talent and a burning fire deep inside, just like you and I. Then come Monday, the major tier gets a very special treat. It's our exclusive interview with reissue genius Bob Irwin. Bob and his wife Mary started the Sundazed music label in 1989. His skill at restoring old vinyl records for the then new CD format attracted the attention of major labels, who increasingly solicited him to help them reissue material from their back catalogs. His restoration work has included early material by the likes of Bob Dylan, Nancy Sinatra, and the Byrds. In this episode, Bob discusses his relationship with Pet Sounds, its standing in the pantheon no matter how many times you've heard it, its importance and influence on music in general, and the wonders of a technology with inherent imposed limitations. There will be a very short sneak peek running publicly for free on Monday morning, but the entirety of the show will only be accessible on the major tier of our Patreon. Don't miss it, or you'll only be getting part of the story. And then on Wednesday, the Lieutenant tier gets their early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of our If I Could Only Remember My Name, Graham Nash Deep Dive podcast. It's the episode as it was truly intended to be heard, with all the essentials left intact. And then come Friday, everyone else gets to join in on the action. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, Chuck Granata, Richard Holland, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, Jay Schultz, Bespoke LA, my mom, my dad, Joe Kennedy for that killer new theme song, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator, and much, much more. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the classic rock and roll from the 1960s is to go to the Beach Boys Season 1, Catch a Wave, 1961 to 1964, from episode 189 on, the Righteous Brothers Bill Medley interview, that's 181 and 182, my interview with the Free Design, that's 160 to 162. My epic interview with the Mamas and Papas Michelle Phillips, that's 141 to 159. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, that's 137. My 12-hour interview with Terry Kirkman and Jules Alexander from the Association, that's 109 to 113. Vashti Bunyan reading her entire output, that's 103 to 104. Sergio Diaz from Os Mutantes, that's 86 and 87. Bert Summer, that's 83 and 84. Sweetwater is episode 79. A tribute to David Crosby, 77 and 78. Andrew Tuttle rates the Monks, 74. Jim Florentine on Black Sabbath is 64 to 68. Lou Barlow on the Zombies is 59 and 60. Marvin Gaye biographer David Ritz rates Marvin Gaye, that's 45 to 47. Blind Faith is 43. Anthony Fantano rates the Velvet Underground, it's 32 and 33. Bob Forrest rates the band is 25 and 27. Monkees manager Andrew Sandoval rates the Monkees, that's 22 and 23. Don Randy rates David Axelrod as 17. Badfinger is 16. The Bee Gees is 10 and 11. Sly and the Family Stone is 5, 6, and 7. And Pink Floyd is 1 and 2. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, November 14th, we're coming at you with the Graham Nash deep dive on one of the greatest albums of all time, David Crosby's classic solo debut, If I Could Only Remember My Name. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!